July 14, 1997 Wrestling Observer Newsletter, Pitbulls arrested. Excellent WWF Canadian Stampede Pay-Per-View. More. By Observer staff. The arrest of Gary Wolfe and Anthony Durante, ECW's Pitbulls, by federal authorities on July 2 on 3 counts of steroid and marijuana trafficking just adds to the list of arrests of pro wrestlers this year predominantly on drug charges. It once again points to an industry that, while in many ways is thriving on the outside, seems to be in other ways a ticking time bomb that may be setting itself up for the same collapse that befell it only 5 years earlier. In recent months, we've seen 9 arrests and a few trips to rehab or drug suspensions of wrestlers, which may not sound like that huge a total, but it is when you consider it's only a 6-month period we're talking about and it's an industry that really only has about 200 or so wrestlers in it. It's a problem that goes far deeper than any individual promotion, and problems have taken place internally in most major promotions in the world. Pro wrestling and drug problems is hardly a new story. In the mid-80s, the problems were cocaine and downers and to a lesser extent steroids, which led to several major deaths of wrestlers that quite frankly had they lived would have changed the entire landscape of the industry, and a no-show problem of major stars. Ironically, even with the body count, that drug story didn't hurt the industry's growth since the media never picked up on it. But in 1991, when Dr. George Zarian was convicted of illegally distributing steroids to a number of WWF wrestlers, it set the stage for a scandal that got a good deal of media coverage and greatly damaged the WWF. Not that it was alone in having a drug problem, but the fact is it was a company at the time built on the back of steroids. Its top stars, marketed to fans as clean-living anti-drug superheroes, were people like Ultimate Warrior and Hulk Hogan. Hogan painted the bullseye on both himself and Vince McMahon by lying under pressure, and there are circumstances remarkably similar in the profession today, including more media attention than ever before. Right down to a few doctors known in the industry as being handymen with a prescription pad, although none with the visibility and name recognition inside the profession like Zarian had during the 80s, and with the laws on steroids changing and use decreasing, those are no longer the drugs in question. That may set the stage for history repeating itself, particularly if a major star either gets busted or collapses in public. The world has changed, and where 5 years ago everyone in the industry did whatever they could to unsuccessfully deny or hide the problem, today, particularly in WCW, certain wrestlers have at times come close to almost flaunting the fact they are loaded and can get away with it every Monday night. In a business that appears to be more star-driven than ever before, the feeling as a big name can flagrantly do anything these days and get away with it, and that goes a whole lot deeper than the drug issue. Can you imagine a situation currently if an NFL team had a publicized quarterback controversy which affected the 2 guys fighting over the spot so much that they both got into a fight backstage where one pulled the other's hair out and both wound up aggravating already injured knees to the point both had to miss several key games? What the reaction of the team, the league, and the media would be? Certainly it wouldn't be to be somewhat embarrassed and pass it off as boys being boys. Realistically, a situation the same night in WCW with Kevin Nash and Roddy Piper, had it happened in another sport, likely would not have resulted in any major disciplinary problems and would have been viewed as boys being boys because nobody got hurt, but I don't see in any other sport if the Bret Hart/Shawn Michaels situation had happened where the organization would have reacted the way that WWF did. In recent months, there have been publicized arrests of Doug Gilbert, Tommy Rich, Steve Williams, Gary Wolfe, Anthony Durante, Alex Rizzo, Big Dick Dudley, Leon Vader White twice no less in a 2-week period in Kuwait, and Billy Travis. Not to mention Scott Hall checking himself into rehab and a suspension of Brian Jesse James. Those names cut across every promotion and include major superstars and journeyman wrestlers. They don't include the alarming frequency where major stars have showed up on Monday nights in condition where they are barely making it through their interviews because they are so loaded. The aforementioned arrests are all isolated incidents in their own way, some quite minor, some having absolutely nothing to do with drugs, some are almost in their own strange way black comedies, and all can be explained away as isolated incidents except that there are too many of them happening too frequently in a profession where too few people are employed. Ever since Hall checked into rehab, combined with WCW continuing to advertise him for shows that they full well knew he wasn't going to appear on, that company, particularly due to its high visibility with usage of top pro athletes on its major shows, opened itself up for the same potential bullseye of bad publicity that ECW did with the Eric Kulas incident. We may be one incident by a major star away, and perhaps not even that, from one influential reporter playing connect the dots of this story, and we'll be back to a situation where, like 1992, the profession starts lying for cover and digging itself into a deeper hole. In some of the aforementioned cases, wrestlers have lost their jobs or a secondary job. In other cases, nothing of the sort. Probably in a lot of cases the wrestlers shouldn't have lost their jobs over the incidents. During the same period, drug testing has for all real purposes been dropped in both WWF and WCW, although both theoretically still have policies in effect. But even when there was drug testing, virtually nobody in the industry believed the policies were indiscriminately enforced, or that if top stars were to fail a test that they would actually be punished unless it was an extenuating circumstance such as Hall showing up positive in a test on the same day he gave notice. You can't be realistic and be all pristine about the drug issue in wrestling at the same time. The nature of this industry breeds drug problems. The physical punishment, self-inflicted in most cases, can be brutal among the wrestlers with the most internal drive to get over, and it's no surprise that many of the hardest working wrestlers are going to wind up hooked on downers. While steroid use is still around, it is nothing close to rampant nor on the level of just 5 years ago due to the change in the fans' taste for work rate over a stationary cosmetic package. While there are a handful of wrestlers due to their prescribed roles that still almost need to take steroids for their specific role, just as virtually every woman in this profession needs a boob job to get over, that number today is exceedingly few. But you can't defend the industry because for those that play those roles, because there are certain characters who by their gimmick are pretty well forced to use steroids. Unlike in the 80s where the mentality was you needed a physique to get a good job, the majority of the wrestlers using steroids today really are doing so making their own personal choice, but not all. Many said that in the 80s, even under oath, but when you consider probably 80% or more of the major wrestlers were using steroids just 6 years ago, and today that figure is so much lower among the basic group of people in the industry, tells me the decision-making process wasn't internal by the wrestlers, even among those who believe their own decisions were, but coming from external pressures, as those same wrestlers who recognize that steroids today aren't going to be much of a factor in them getting a better job, seem not to be taking steroids today. And don't tell me they are suddenly concerned with their health or the law or had no idea there were negative side effects 6 years ago. The road schedule, while tough, is far easier than in the past when wrestlers really did work 300 matches a year, so the need for uppers to keep going while doing 7 nights a week isn't there like in the previous incarnation of drug problems. But while some of the nearly inhuman working conditions of the past in pro wrestling have been alleviated and pressures to juice up have been greatly lessened, there is a problem that is being ignored, that a series of so-called isolated incidents are signs of a dangerous pattern. Wolf, 30, and Durante, 29, were arrested on July 2nd at their respective homes in South Philadelphia after a grand jury came up with 3 indictments against the two for trafficking in 1995 in their home area. They were released on bail and are awaiting trial. At least at the present time, it's unlikely they'll be used in ECW, just as Williams was no longer used after his recent arrest. It figured going in that the Canadian Stampede Pay-Per-View show on July 6th in Calgary's Saddledome would have a unique bizarro world atmosphere, with the heels being cheered. But I'm not sure anyone could have expected what actually took place. In a show that, due to generally weak hype going in, a change in the title match over the last week due to an injury, and coming at the end of a major holiday weekend, figured to be one of the last anticipated pay-per-view shows in WWF history, turned out to be one of its best shows ever. The crowd atmosphere, which put the show over the top even more than the consistently good wrestling, equaled or exceeded nearly any major show in history. Every match was good, with 2 of the 4 matches being excellent. The risk of doing a 4-match card, which was not in the original cards but ended up that way after a series of injuries racked a company already plagued with depth problems, paid off at the end with a show the level that even the most optimistic going in couldn't have dreamed would turn out the way it did. The show drew a paid attendance of 10,974, 12,151 in the building, and gate of $229,598 along with another $65,000 in merchandise, the latter 2 figure being the largest in each category in the long and illustrious history of pro wrestling in Calgary. It was the 3rd largest crowd ever for wrestling in Calgary, trailing a 1991 card, Hulk Hogan vs. Sergeant Slaughter and Ultimate Warrior vs. Undertaker, that drew 11,153, and a 1987 show Hogan vs. King Kong Bundy, which holds the record of 12,034. The largest crowds for Stampede Wrestling were at the 7,500-seat Calgary Corral, since the Saddledome wasn't built in 1984 and Stu Hart only ran 1 show there. Among the well-known matches that packed the old corral in the Stampede days were George and Sandy Scott vs. Bill and Dan Miller, 1958, Archie Stomper Gouldy vs. Dan Crawford, 1973, Al Mills vs. Stu Hart, 1958, and Dory Funk Jr. vs. Billy Robinson, 1969. The atmosphere, with the Harts being portrayed as the first family of wrestling in their hometowns, working as total babyfaces and being portrayed in the commentary as such, which was really weird, ended up with the Hart family being put over as babyfaces not only by the fans but also by the promotion and the storyline, to the degree that almost nobody ever in wrestling pay-per-view history has ever been put over. The only comparison would have been in 1993 when Ric Flair beat Vader in Charlotte for the WCW title, and with all due respect to the magic of that night, this night in a city known for its wrestling crowds being reserved from all the years of seeing guys like Dynamite Kid work matches that were a generation ahead of its time, blew it away. The amount of media publicity, both with it being the first major match with Bret returning from knee surgery, the first pay-per-view show ever in Calgary, and being part of the annual Stampede, was unprecedented in local wrestling annals. Both the Calgary show and the Edmonton show the next night received front-page newspaper coverage the next morning. There were stories in the newspaper every day, with features on many of the top wrestlers and numerous autograph sessions, including one session for Owen, Bret and Davey Boy, which drew an estimated 8,000 people. For the rest of the world, it was strange at the same time to see Bret Hart, the WWF's lead heel, being presented as a hometown legend, getting a Hogan in his prime response, and being shown and portrayed as a role model who had lines a mile long waiting for autographs at public appearances over the weekend and accommodated everyone who asked. Or how about seeing Owen Hart, the pesky little brother, work a spectacular babyface-like performance, climaxing with him saving the day and leading the good guys to victory, and then celebrating not only with his entire family in the ring, but hugging his baby. Or seeing Davey Boy Smith walking his wife down the aisle and kissing her before the match started to a thunderous ovation. Some main event heel. And what about Brian Pillman, the loose cannon? There he was helping 82-year-old Stu Hart into the ring so the father figure of Calgary wrestling could receive a well-deserved send-off at the end of the night. Hey, where was the cheap shot clothesline? In the WWF's quest to overdo things and explain to the rest of the world why the locals were behaving this way and cheering the wrong guys, they probably succeeded in a sense of having an awful lot of fans wondering why they were the ones rooting against the real babyfaces. Those Canadian fans, who in the clips hardly came off as brain surgeons, still seemed in their less than infinite wisdom to be on the right side. The WWF trying to make sense of the aftermath and move things back to as they were is going to be intriguing. It's almost like you had this dream that you saw one of the best wrestling pay-per-view shows ever, but then you wake up the next morning, and it was almost like it never happened. In the dark match, Henry and Phineas Godwin, Mark Canterbury and Dennis Knight beat the New Blackjacks, John Hawk and Barry Windham, in 5:32 in the free-for-all match. Pretty bad. Phineas pinned Windham with an inside cradle after Windham went for a suplex, but Henry interfered by kicking Windham in the leg. Dud. 1. Mankind, Michael Foley, went to a double countout with Hunter Hearst Helmsley Paul Levesque, in 13:14. A very good match marred only by so much outside interference by Chyna that it became overdone in a lame finish. Mankind suplexed Helmsley on the ramp and got the mandible claw on early, but Chyna broke it with a wicked forearm. Chyna has even more muscular. Did she attend the Pitbulls going out of business sale or what? Outside the ring, Mankind missed a charge at Helmsley and his momentum allowed Chyna to power slam him with his knees landing on the ring steps. Helmsley worked on the knee with a chair and basically destroyed the knee. It was great psychology for this match, but they should have done something different since the main event revolved around selling the knee, and both Steve Austin and Owen Hart in the main event were dragged to the back, taking far less punishment than Mankind did in the opener. Probably due to a lack of communication. Helmsley used a chop block, elbow drop and drop kick to the knee to set up a figure 4. Mankind came back with a headbutt to the groin. Jim Ross had an unintentionally funny line when he said that Mankind weighed 287 pounds to be exact, and that's an estimate. Mankind got a near fall with a pile driver. Mankind did the clothesline where they both go over the top spot. Mankind went to hit Helmsley with a chair, but Chyna stopped him and Helmsley got the chair to the leg again and Chyna leveled Mankind with a stiff clothesline. Helmsley was on the top rope, but Mankind inadvertently stumbled into the ropes and Helmsley crotched himself. Mankind got the claw on again, but Chyna crotched him. They wound up outside the ring with the bell ringing for one of those lame WWF-style double count-out finishes. The two brawled after the match, including Helmsley being thrown into the hockey penalty box and brawled into the crowd. 3 stars. 2. Great Sasuke, Masanori Murakawa, pinned Taka Michinoku, Takao Yoshida, in 10 minutes. As they were doing the ring introductions, Helmsley and Mankind came back out and were brawling with Helmsley with blood all over his face. Because of that, it made it hard for these guys to get going, particularly both being cold and with a style that needs a slow start to build to a big finish. It turned out to be an excellent match, although not to the level of the 6-man on the ECW pay-per-view in April. Believe it or not, these guys actually work longer and more spectacular matches before 250 fans in their home promotion. Michinoku got over more than Sasuke with the crowd and was actually the most impressive wrestler on the entire card. Just as the fans were starting to get bored, the two turned it on with one great spot after another with almost perfect timing. The crowd popped both for the stiff palm blows and kicks and also for the high flying. From an announcing standpoint in this match, both Vince McMahon and Jerry Lawler were out to lunch, and Ross, who everyone would figure would have to carry it, was not anywhere close to the level of Joey Styles in a similar situation when it came to understanding the psychology of what they were doing, let alone knowing who they were and what they were doing. After Michinoku took a backdrop over the top to the floor, Sasuke used a rider kick on him, which is a career-shortening one-footed drop kick from the top rope to the floor, which is a move you simply can't execute safely because your opponent can't protect you on the fall. Michinoku mainly worked on Sasuke's head, stemming from Sasuke's frequent concussions, a storyline that fans weren't educated to. Michinoku used a dragon screw and a drop kick to the knee to set up his springboard plancha, in which he got some major distance and was spectacular. Perhaps the coolest spot of the match was Sasuke going for a German suplex but Michinoku flipping in midair, landing on his feet, and hitting a Frankensteiner without hesitation, and then getting a second near fall with La Magistral. Sasuke came back using an Osai moonsault. Michinoku used a belly-to-belly for a near fall. Michinoku also hit a spectacular springboard dropkick to the back and his Michinoku driver 2 for near falls. Michinoku went for another dropkick off the top, but Sasuke got up and met him with a dropkick, hit an inside the ring quebrada, lionsault, a thunderfire powerbomb and finished with a tiger suplex. 4 stars. After the match, they cut to the parking lot where Mankind and Helmsley brawled once again. This was pretty cool with Helmsley whipping Mankind into kegs of beer and breaking a shovel over his back among other things. 3. Undertaker Mark Calloway pinned Vader, Leon White, in 12:39 to retain the WWF title. A good but not great match. Undertaker did a lot of his early spots until he went after Paul Bearer and Vader got the advantage. Vader did a big splash for a near fall. At about the 8 minutes mark, the building was just rocking to a level that you barely ever see for Undertaker's comeback. He went for a choke slam but Vader instead hit a low blow. Undertaker went for a tombstone but Vader reversed it, but Vader actually collapsed doing the reversal and they blew the spot. Vader came back and went for his Vader bomb finisher that he used to beat Undertaker at the Royal Rumble, a clip shown twice during the broadcast, but Undertaker sat up and gave Vader a low blow. Undertaker choke slammed Vader off the ropes for a near fall. He used a second choke slam for another near fall. Finally he hit the tombstone and that was it. 3¼ stars. 4. Bret and Owen Hart and Davey Boy Smith and Jim Neidhart and Brian Pillman beat Steve Austin, Steve Williams, and Legion of Doom, Joe Laurinaitis and Michael Hagstrand, and Ken Shamrock and Goldust, Dustin Runnels, in 24:31. When the babyfaces, or heels, or whatever, came out first, a crowd booed them, but there was no sense it was anything special other than Austin's reaction was unusually strong. Actually, LOD got mostly cheers, Shamrock got noticeably more boos than cheers, Goldust was heavily booed, Austin was booed out of the building. Pillman got the first introduction for the home team and the crowd blew the roof off the place like it was the local college team's starting 5 against its traditional conference rivals. Bret started with Austin, with Bret working as the face and the heat being incredible. Bret's knee was clearly nowhere close to 100%. Shamrock and Neidhart tagged in and the place went nuts with anvil chants. Shamrock used an ankle lock but Neidhart made the ropes. Shamrock went for a kneebar submission and McMahon called it a pinning combination. Place went nuts when Pillman tagged in and was chopping and slapping Shamrock and gave him a backbreaker. When Owen tagged in with Goldust, if anything it was even more pronounced. Hawk got a near fall on Owen with a splash off the top. Owen used the Scorpion on Hawk but it was broken up. Smith power slammed Hawk for a near fall but Goldust saved. Finally Owen missed a charge into the corner and started selling like a face. He made his own comeback with a dropkick and nip up to a huge pop. He went for a Frankensteiner on Animal but Animal instead power bombed him and hit a power slam. The LOD did the double impact on Owen, but Neidhart saved him. Austin then rammed Owen's knee into the post and hit the knee with a chair. The heel heat on Austin at this point was amazing. Owen was taken to the back to make it 5-on-4. Bret then rammed Austin's knee into the post and used the figure 4 around the post on him and Austin was taken to the back to even the odds. The only point where the crowd died was at this point with Austin not involved. For the first 1450 it was among the best North American matches of the year, But it kind of turned into a Mexican match at this point with everyone in the ring for so long, and it got a little unwieldy in spots, but still a great match. Shamrock took a bump into one of the tables and Hawk took a whip into the ring steps. Shamrock actually low-blowed Smith. Smith used a superplex off the top on Goldust that took forever to get in position for. At 21 minutes, Austin returned to work spots with Brett back and forth. Brett got the sharpshooter on but Animal saved. Austin then put the sharpshooter on Brett and Owen came limping from the back for a diving save. Austin clotheslined Owen over the top rope. At this point, Austin went after Stu Hart at ringside and Bruce Hart, still decked out in his 1987 Bad Company tag team name of Bruce Hart and Brian Pillman when Pillman was a rookie with Stampede Wrestling, leather jacket and sunglasses, got involved. Austin threw Wayne Hart and BJ Annis, a Hart brother-in-law who wrestled more than a decade ago for Stampede, over the rail, and while this was all going on, Owen pinned Austin with a schoolboy. The wrestlers and family members continued to brawl until the Keystone Cops came out again to break things up. They started a Hart family celebration in the ring, but Austin came back and hit Neidhart with a chair before half the family jumped him again, including a totally over-exuberant Bruce, before the cops cuffed him and took him out. As he was leaving with the cuffs on, he bent over and flipped off the crowd on the way out. It was a super heel performance by Austin and an incredible spectacle overall. Show ended with the entire Hart family, all the kids and grandkids along with Stu and Helen in the ring to this thunderous ovation that I can only compare with the afternoon at Texas Stadium in 1984 when Kerry Von Erich beat Ric Flair to win the NWA title. 4 1/4 stars. The much talked about ECW/WWF relationship appears to be very close to falling apart as the so-called ECW match was pulled from the SummerSlam pay-per-view show. Technically, a match involving Jerry Lawler, or Sabu, and Rob Van Dam vs. Sandman and Tommy Dreamer was at no point ever officially on the card, but there was at least a working understanding that they were building to that match likely for SummerSlam, or if not, for the subsequent pay-per-view show in September in Louisville. Given that USWA is pushing a similar feud currently on its television, it shouldn't be a surprise if a deal is put back together for that match in Louisville. To say the situation between the two companies over the past week is hard to figure would be an understatement. Paul Heyman claims that WWF had discussed with him doing an ECW match at SummerSlam, but the two sides hadn't finalized an agreement, both financially and otherwise, regarding such a match. WWF claims that match wasn't in the plans for SummerSlam of late. WWF sources said that Heyman agreed to co-host Shotgun Saturday Night beginning with the show taped June 30th in Des Moines, Iowa, which is why they shot the angle on June 23rd to eliminate Brian Pillman from the broadcast booth. Heyman claimed he was never asked to do the show, only that they sent him a ticket to Des Moines and indicated they had a surprise for him. Heyman's name was on the format sheet as the co-host with Jim Ross for the Shotgun show in Des Moines, but since he wasn't there, he was replaced by his good friend Jim Cornette. All week long, WWF officials attempted to get hold of Heyman from the afternoon when he wasn't in Des Moines, with no success. WWF officials were doubly frustrated, claiming that Heyman never called the building in Des Moines to say he wasn't going to be there, but only left a message on Bruce Pritchard's answering machine at home, knowing full well Pritchard was in Iowa at the time. In addition, Chris Condito was in Des Moines as he is at most Raw tapings to accompany his fiancée, and WWF officials claimed Condito also couldn't get a hold of Heyman, although other sources indicated that Condito and Heyman were actually in regular contact that day via the cell phone. As late as Thursday, when voiceovers were being done for the weekend Shotgun show, WWF officials were still trying to contact Heyman, figuring it could chromo key him in the studio since almost all the actual voiceover work for the show is done in studio later in the week and the live show is mainly just for stand-ups and live interviews. As of press time, there has been no contact between Heyman and WWF, although there probably will be before any of you read this, and once that happens, the entire situation could change again. Since there has been no contact, the situation seems to be that nobody really knows where this thing is headed. Heyman's feeling is that while he was intrigued with the idea of doing a Channel 31 show in New York, which WWF is paying $7,000 per week to get weekly broadcast syndication back in the market and doing New York-specific commentary, particularly since ECW has a 2 a.m. time slot coming on the same station, that there were too many problems and wasn't as interested in doing commentary on the national version of Shotgun. He felt he couldn't, for example, put over Owen Hart and Davey Boy Smith as a great tag team on WWF without bringing up the Dudleys or Eliminators, that he couldn't talk about Ken Shamrock as a shooter without putting over Taz, put over Sasuke's high-risk moves without bringing up Sabu, etc., with the fear he'd turn his territory into what Jerry Lawler turned USWA into, where it became obvious to the home folks that they were a minor league group. All of this came on the heels on the problems on June 30th in Detroit at the Raw taping, where WWF officials were upset with the behavior of Sabu and Rob Van Dam and complaining about or not doing, respectively, the Astra finishes. Talks with WWF and Heyman give a totally different viewpoint on where Heyman stood in that situation. The WWF claimed Heyman was totally apologetic and embarrassed about the behavior of Sabu and Van Dam in Detroit, while Heyman himself says he backed Sabu and Van Dam all the way, and it was largely he that was upset about his main eventers not going over on WWF preliminary wrestlers on television. Heyman and McMahon had a meeting on June 27th where McMahon complained to Heyman about the behavior of Sabu and Van Dam at the tapings, both in not doing the finishes asked and also of Sabu running through the crowd, but the meeting didn't end on a note where anyone figured the relationship was over. As in any situation of this type, both sides become subconscious over who is getting the better of the deal. ECW was getting its company publicity and adding visibility in new markets to its cult following. The appearances of ECW talent haven't appeared to have made any positive difference in the Raw ratings, which was the WWF's hope, but nor have they been a detriment in the ratings, as was many people's fear. In yet another aspect of this situation, Joey Styles, real name Joe Bonsignori, has been making noises about suing the WWF because he appears in the Steve Austin video and the WWF never asked for his permission. Styles, citing the Jesse Ventura verdicts as a precedent, was in specific referring to the Austin interview while in ECW, where he mocks Hulk Hogan, and Styles is part of that interview. The footage to promote the video aired on Raw on June 30th with a tagline courtesy of ECW. Heyman claims that WWF only asked his permission to use an Austin interview where he calls Nancy Sullivan a $5 piece of ass and says that he can't help it if she married a midget, and Heyman said that he was asked for it to be on broadcast television as opposed to being in a home video, which go under totally different guidelines legally. Yet in this day and age, particularly in the wake of the Ventura verdict, it is hard to believe the WWF would make such an elementary mistake in packaging a video without getting specific written permission in regard to any outside footage. ECW and USWA are continuing their angle, with a July 13th show in Memphis including matches with Lawler and Brian Christopher vs. Sandman and Dreamer, and Taz and Condito vs. Sabu and Van Dam. Lawler and Jim Cornette are both scheduled to work for ECW on July 11th in Asbury Park, New Jersey, and Lawler is booked on at least two other ECW dates, the July 19th ECW Arena show and the August 17th pay-per-view show. USWA officials are trying to book ECW talent into Louisville, since the first Lawler vs. Dreamer match, which only drew about 560 in Memphis, drew 900 into Louisville a few nights later. Larry O'Day, who had been both a major wrestling star and a longtime promoter in Australia, passed away on June 30th at the age of 53 from liver cancer. O'Day, who had continued to wrestle infrequently up until the time of his death, was considered the second lead babyface on the Australian scene during the mid-70s behind longtime tag team partner Ron Miller. The two also ran the National Wrestling Company from about 1974 until the promotion folded at the end of 1978. He had continued to promote and wrestle on an irregular basis, and had maintained membership in the National Wrestling Alliance, both in its worldwide incarnation and later its current incarnation out of New Jersey. O'Day and Miller actually got their first break as a tag team called the Australians in Florida in 1971 and 1972, where they held the Florida tag team titles on 4 occasions. They first won the belts on August 5, 1971 from Ron Garvin and Ole Anderson in Jacksonville. They lost them on October 21, 1971 in Tampa to Dick Murdoch and Bobby Duncombe. They regained them a few weeks later in Miami before losing them to the Alaskans, Mike York and Frank Monty, on December 8, 1971, in Miami the next week. They lost the belts to the Masked Infernos, Frankie Great Mephisto Kane and Rocky Smith, on January 10, 1972 in West Palm Beach, but regained them on February 15, 1972 in Tampa. They lost the titles for the final time on March 9, 1972 in Tampa to Bobby Shane and Bearcat Wright before returning home and becoming the top babyface tag team in their native land. They captured the Australasian tag team titles for the first time on March 30, 1973 in Sydney from Don Carson and Dick Dunn. They lost them on May 13, 1973 in Sydney to Waldo Von Erich and Hiro Tojo. By the time they regained the belts for a second time on February 8, 1974 in Sydney from Hiro and Hito Tojo, the latter being Akihisa Mera, who later gained his most fame under the name The Great Kabuki, they had ownership interest in the promotion. They vacated the title after doing an injury angle and regained the belts again on July 5, 1974 in Sydney from Bobby Shane and Mr. Wrestling, George Barnes, before losing them on May 9, 1975 in Sydney to the Missouri Mauler, Larry Rocky Hamilton, and Steve Reckman. ODAY teamed with Bobby Hart on June 1, 1975 to regain the titles, before losing them on August 1, 1975 to Skander Akbar and George Gulivos. In September 1976, ODAY teamed with Ed Wiscoski, later known as Colonel De Beers, to win the titles from Johnny Gray and Kevin Martin, before ODAY and Wiscoski had a split up. In a tag match on February 18, 1977 in Sydney, ODAY and new partner Rick Martel beat Wiscoski and new partner Masa Saito. ODAY and Martel ended up losing the titles to Butcher Brannigan, Joe Nova, and Bugsy McGraw, Michael Davis. ODAY and Hart wound up winning a tournament to regain the title on March 3, 1978 in Sydney and vacated the title when Hart left the promotion. His final title reign came with Mario Milano as his partner on October 1, 1978, beating Brannigan and Leigh Roberts, which lasted until October 27, 1978, when they lost to Brannigan and Ox Baker. ODAY and Milano, now 62, were still wrestling as a main event tag team on small shows in Australia as recently as a few months back. The only recent appearance by ODAY in the United States would have been on June 16, 1992 at the WCW Clash of the Champions in Charleston, South Carolina, as part of a tournament to crown what turned out to be short-lived NWA Tag Team Champions. And ODAY came to the ring with his son Jeff and were destroyed in the first round by Terry Gordy and Steve Williams in 2:35. They were brought in as a political favor since ODAY had remained a voting member of the NWA. We also have gotten some more notes on the wrestling career of Stan Stasiak, who passed away on June 19. Stasiak's real name was George Stipich, but got his wrestling name early in his career from a wrestling promoter who said he reminded him of the original Stan Stasiak. It was interesting in that all the Portland area newspaper obits listed his name as Stan Stasiak and not George Stipich. According to a lengthy article in the Oregonian on June 27, which did list his real name, Stasiak was a good enough hockey player in his youth to have been signed by the New York Rangers. The article claimed that his wrestling celebrityhood gave his chances to personally meet John F. Kennedy, Maury Amsterdam, a famous comedian in the 60s, and Mo Howard, of Three Stooges fame. Some more career notes included Stasiak, after beginning his career in Quebec in 1958, went to Stampede Wrestling in Calgary as his first territory in 1959 under the ring name Emile Kovlory as a prelim wrestler. By the early 60s, he had runs in both Ontario and in St. Louis, and he was already Stan Stasiak, and known as the Arvida Assassin from his original hometown of Arvida, Quebec, and had matches with the likes of Bruno Sammartino, Sammy Steamboat, and Jim Hottie. He returned to Stampede Wrestling as a headliner from 1967 to 1969, and held the Canadian heavyweight title once and the North American title twice, feuding with the likes of Dave Roll, Archie the Stomper Gouldy, who he drew his biggest gates as a singles wrestler against, and Luther Lindsay. In 1967, at the company's biggest show of the year in conjunction with the Calgary Stampede, similar to the deal with WWF this year, Stasiak was the headliner challenging Gene Kiniski for the NWA World Heavyweight title. His biggest money matches were a series of bouts where he teamed with Shag Thomas against Lindsay and former boxing champion Jersey Joe Walcott, with the idea that Stasiak's big heart punch would be against Walcott's knockout punch. Although he was a big draw in Stampede, his legendary drinking problems caused trouble outside the ring and led to him being fired from the territory. The Oregonian article by Tom Hallman Jr. also talked about former wrestling stars from the late 60s and early 70s era of Portland wrestling and where they ended up. It claimed Beauregard Jim Pitchford is rumored to be living the high life somewhere on the East Coast. He hasn't been heard from in 20 years, but it's a nice thought. It talked of 71-year-old tough Tony Bourne playing with his grandchildren, Haru Sasaki working as a baker's helper at a grocery store in Lake Oswego, Oregon, in a spectacular auto accident in 1978 that ended the life of Lonnie Moon Dog Main. New Japan announced the bracketing this past week for the G1 tournament from August 1 to August 3 at Tokyo Sumo Hall. The tournament on paper appears to be similar to the recent junior heavyweight tournament, as a disappointment as compared to years past. As mentioned earlier, it'll be single elimination instead of a round-robin format, since they have to finish the entire deal in 3 days rather than 5 days, as they had last year. Marcus Bagwell and Kensuke Sasaki were given a first-round bye, and they'll face each other on August 2nd. The matches on August 1st will be Great Muta vs. Manabu Nakanishi, Junji Hirata vs. Scott Norton, Hiroyoshi Tenzan vs. Tadao Yasuda, Steven Regal vs. Satoshi Kojima, Shinya Hashimoto vs. Kazuo Yamazaki, and Michiyoshi Ohara vs. Masahiro Chono. Those matches would appear to set up an August 2nd card that would have, besides the Bagwell vs. Sasaki match, Muta vs. Norton, Kojima or Regal vs. Tenzan, and Hashimoto vs. Chono. The August 3rd show will have both the semifinals and the championship match. There are a lot of ways it could go, since Hashimoto vs. Chono for the IWGP title will headline the Nagoya Dome show on August 10th, and it is looking like a good shot Chono will win the title. They could put Chono over to set him up for the title match, or they could have Hashimoto beat Chono if Chono is going to beat Hashimoto for the title 1 week later. Puerto Rico. It appears with the folding of WWA that most if not all the wrestlers who left WWC for the new group won't be welcome back, at least at the present time. WWC is going through its own financial hardships. Tahiti and Kuhio won the WWC Tag Team titles from Ricky Santana and Lale on June 22 in Bayamon. They are doing a big angle regarding the identity of Golden Boy, actually Chicky Star, who lost the Loser Leaves Town match. Lale, who is a police officer in his real job known for solving crimes, and the angle is the one vowing to solve the mystery. Apparently a comedian on a local television show named Cabo Santarosa on June 30 mentioned that Golden Boy was actually Chicky Star, but that once it was mentioned that WWC would try to show them together and have another person as Golden Boy temporarily to prove that statement wrong. They reheated the centuries-old Abdullah the Butcher vs. Carlos Colon feud with an angle on June 20 where Butcher did a number on Colon's eye with a fork. The Sheep Herders, or Los Pastores as they are also known, doing their old heel gimmick, did an angle where they broke the shoulder of Pablo Marx. Seiji Yamakawa and Yoshihiro Tajiri of Big Japan were in, but due to money problems, are already gone to Mexico. Both were promised $300 a week for coming in, but were never paid and left. Great Sensei, Hiroshi Hatanaka, was promised $500 per week, but after 5 weeks they were already $800 behind on paying him and still owed him $1,700 from a previous tour, and many other foreign wrestlers are owed large sums of money. Capital Sports, which was once a thriving promotion that employed 20 front office employees alone, now has a front office that consists of Colon and Victor Jovica, and they are literally hanging by a thread. It is expected when the tournament is over that Ray Gonzalez will wind up as Universal Champion. EMLL Felino won the WWA welterweight title from El Hijo del Santo in the main event on the July 4th show at Arena Mexico to further build up their mask versus mask match for September. It was a totally cheap finish after Felino had taken the first fall with a powerbomb. Santo was destroying Felino, giving him powerbomb after powerbomb when outside the ring, seconds Bestia Salvaje and Negro Casas began arguing. Salvaje got mad and threw his towel at Casas, who ducked, and the towel went into the ring and the ref saw it and stopped the match. The semifinal was a battle of heels as the Headhunters and Steel beat Bestia Salvaje and Scorpio Jr. and Dr. Wagner Jr. Yoshihiro Tajiri returned on the undercard. El Satanico captured the Independent World Junior Heavyweight title, or as it was billed in Mexico, the FMW Middleweight title, from Takamichi Noku on June 29 at Arena Coliseo in Mexico City. Promo AZTECA. The July 4th show in now Calpan drew a sellout 3,000 fans. Don't have a lot of details on the show other than it was said to have been one of the best TV tapings in the history of the promotion. The main event was La Parca and Hector Garza and Vampiro vs. Pierroth Jr. and Dandy and Mascara Año 2000. Pierroth and Dandy turned on Mascara Año 2000. Also at the finish, Conan hit the ring and jawed off with Vampiro. The crowd was pretty split in this one, and apparently Conan and Vampiro are each going to have their own groups, which is the thing in wrestling today, and start the gang feud. The semifinal was Rey Mysterio Jr. and Super Calo and Super Parca, formerly Volador, against Juventud Guerrera and Psicosis Enigma, which ended when Psicosis destroyed Mysterio Jr.'s need to do the Mexican version of the angle to explain Rey being out of action for a few months. On July 9th, Mysterio Jr. is scheduled to defend his Mexican welterweight title against Psicosis, and Psicosis is going to win the title by forfeit when Mysterio Jr. shows up on crutches. AAA. A couple of title changes. Cobarde Jr. won what is being billed as the UWA heavyweight title from Perro Aguayo on June 27 at the Perro Aguayo Center in Tala, Jalisco. The actual UWA heavyweight champion isn't almost always his Kinect, and the belt Aguayo had was the old UWA junior light heavyweight belt that was upgraded at some point to a heavyweight title. Giving Cobarde the belt in Oguayo's hometown at the arena named for him was a way to try and get him over as a strong lead heel now that Puerto Jr. has left the promotion. That show drew a disappointing crowd of only 2,000. Cibernetico won the Mexican national heavyweight title from Mascara Sagrada, who is now back to his old identity of Cranio, on June 15 in Pantilan. Top Win Promotions, headed by Dos Caras, ran the Big Triangle Mask vs. Mask match with Mil Mascaras, Tinieblas Sr. and Gran Marcus Jr. The show was a total flop, drawing only 1,500 fans to the 18,000-seat arena that AAA had come close to selling out 2 weeks earlier. Marcus Jr. was promised a $10,000 payoff for doing the job. Because the crowd was so small, they didn't do much in the match. It started out with Marcus versus Tinieblas, and Marcus broke a beer bottle over Tinieblas' head before the match actually started, and ref Pepe Casas called for the DQ, so Tinieblas actually never wrestled. Mascaras and Marcus did a singles match with lots of interference by both Aguayo, in Mil's corner, and Cobarde, in Marcus' corner. Mil finally got the pin with his 60-year-old flying body press in what all the magazines described as an awful match from start to finish. Marcus, whose father feuded with Mascaras in another lifetime, unmasked, revealing Candido Robles Cruz, 39, from Guadalajara, who has been wrestling for 22 years. They had scheduled a return date on July 6 with Mascaras and Dos Caras and Tinieblas Jr. versus Marcus Jr. and Killer and Cobarde Jr., but after licking their wounds on the heavy financial losses, the show was cancelled and the promotion has folded. Shu El Guerrero and Fantasma have left Promo Azteca to return here. All Japan. The Patriot, who left the promotion and signed with WWF without apparently informing Giant Baba, was officially fired this past week when word reached Japan about him wrestling Rockabilly on the June 30 WWF show in Des Moines. Patriot had told the office he needed an operation due to suffering a torn tricep and would be out of action for several months. This was after All Japan created the new threesome called GET of Patriot and Kenta Kobashi and Johnny Ace. Johnny Smith, who is a good worker but on the short side in a promotion usually built around taller guys, and who has a history of being a prelim wrestler here, has joined Kobashi and Ace in the group. In addition, there are rumors in Japan already that Ace will be the next one to join the WWF. Hiroshi Hase returned on July 3 in Osaka, teaming with Daisuke Ikeda of Battlers to beat Kentaro Shiga and Tamon Honda. Hase will be working 8 shows this month during a break in his Senate schedule, including on July 6 teaming with Akira Tao for the first time, beating Steve Williams and the Lacrosse in Koga. On July 4 in Inan, Hase teamed with Honda to beat Stan Hansen and Smith. During that match, Hase did a 36 Revolution Giant Swing spot, which breaks the All Japan Company record of 32 revolutions that he set earlier this year. Yoshihiro Takayama of Kingdom will be working here on July 20th, July 21st, and at Budokan Hall on July 25th. At Budokan, Takayama and Lacrosse face Toshiaki Kawada and Honda, which will likely build up a singles match against Kawada for later in the year. June 29th television show did a 2.4 rating. New Japan. The big show of the tour was July 6 in Sapporo for the first wrestling card at the new Makomanai Ice Arena, which drew a sellout 10,000 with Riki Choshu and Shinya Hashimoto beating Masahiro Chono and Great Muta in the main event. The finish saw Muta accidentally hit Chono with a baseball bat and Choshu pinned Chono after 2 lariats in 12:39. Choshu was only supposed to work 2 shows on this tour, the other being on July 1 in Hachinohe, where he teamed with Tatsumi Fujinami to beat Akira Nagami and Tatsutoshi Goto when Choshu pinned Goto after a lariat. However, with Muta and Chono leaving on July 11 to appear on the WCW Bash at the Beach pay-per-view, Choshu is going work July 11 as a replacement. Also in Sapporo, El Samurai captured the J-Crown, which now consists of 7 championships, pinning Jushin Liger in 1940 after a swinging DDT and 2 reverse DDTs. After the match, Koji Kanemoto, who lost to Samurai in the Super Junior Finals, challenged Samurai to a title match which I'd expect to take place at the Nagoya Dome. The reason the title switched is that over the next several months New Japan has to give back all the various titles, and Liger didn't want to do 7 different jobs, so I suspect they'll have Samurai give back 1 or 2 belts and Kanemoto give back the rest, while maintaining the IWGP Junior title. Liger already gave back to War International Junior title to Yuji Yasuhiro on June 6. Besides the IWGP belt, the other belts in the J-Crown are the NWA World Junior Heavyweight, Great Britain Junior Heavyweight, WWF Light Heavyweight, which either will have to be abandoned since the WWF is creating a new title from the same name. This title belt was created by WWF President Hisashi Shinma in 1981 for something for Pero Aguayo and Gran Hamada to feud over in Japan, but ended up the past 16 years as being a UWA-based Mexican championship, or perhaps dropped to Sasuke, who take the belt back into WWF, although WWF itself has ordered a new championship belt: WWA Junior Light Heavyweight, UWA Light Heavyweight, and NWA Welterweight. In the other major matches on the show, Naoya Ogawa beat Kazuo Yamazaki via submission in 8:30 in what was said to have been a good match, and Antonio Inoki and Tiger King beat Kensuke Sasaki and Kazuyuki Fujita in 9:34. Fujita's first major singles match of his career will be on August 2nd at Tokyo Sumo Hall against the debuting Don Frye. Chono's photo shoot with Hideo Nomo of the Los Angeles Dodgers, who is a god in Japan right now, made all the magazine covers this week. Both Michael Wallstreet and Dean Malenko arrived this past week. Wallstreet is working 8-mans as part of the NWO and going over every night. Malenko is working undercard junior matches. Muta did an interview talking about his match with Ogawa at the Nagoya Dome, saying that Ogawa is nothing but Inoki's robot. On July 4th in Hakodate, the main event was a 10-man tag with the NWO against New Japan, ending with Muta pinning Hashimoto after blowing the mist in his eyes. After the match, Muta spray-painted NWO on Hashimoto's back. June 28th television show did a 2.3 rating. Other Japan notes. Inichiro Tenryu had his 20th year memorial show on July 6th at Sumo Hall before about 6,000 fans. In the top 4 matches, Tenryu pinned Tarzan Goto in 16:59. About the only unique aspect of this very stiff match was that Goto took Tenryu's shoes off so that his enzujiri wouldn't be as effective, but Tenryu used the move with less effectiveness but still won using the power bomb. Koki Kitahara and Nobutaka Araya and Lance Storm won the Vacant War 6-man titles, beating Koji Kiao and Tommy Dreamer and Nobukazu Hirai in 1646 when Kitahara pinned Hirai. Yujiyasu Ryoka retained the International Junior title, pinning Masao Orihara in 1706. In their first singles meeting perhaps ever, and certainly their first in more than 15 years, Yoshiaki Fujiwara pinned Abdullah the Butcher in Butcher's first job with this company in 1419. As you can imagine, this match was a major style clash. The biggest news at the show was the appearance of Akira Maeda, who came to the ring after Tenryu won and shook hands with him and congratulated him on his 20 years in the ring. Maeda has never wrestled Tenryu, but said that he wasn't here to challenge him to a match. Maeda said over the house mic that he was going to retire in 1998 and was working on doing his retirement match against either George Foreman or Hickson Gracie. Toshio Yamada will be leaving AJW for Gia, with her final AJW match being on July 13th at Korakuen Hall. AJW wanted Yamada, 27, to retire as they've stopped pushing her and were going to do the retirement show on this week. However, after a meeting with the office, Yamada, who has worked several Gia shows of late as her hero growing up was Chigusa Nagio, got their agreement that she'd start full-time with Gia on July 21st. Bison Kimura had a 7-hour-long operation on her broken left arm on July 4th. Kimura was supposed to retire in September, but the injury has delayed those plans and she's not expected back in the ring now until January. There's a very similar situation involving AJW's Takako Inoue. She broke the orbital bone in her eye and suffered a serious concussion after taking a bump from the top rope to the floor on July 2nd in Abashiri. There was some talk the injury was so severe it would be career-ending, although most of the talk now is that she'll be back in action in early 1998. JWP's Dynamite Kansai is back in the hospital and will be out of action for a few weeks due to an illness. Kansai has been ill a lot of late, but we don't know exactly what the real story is here. Shiro Koshinaka had his Achilles tendon surgery this past week, and while in the hospital on July 2nd, his mother passed away. Lots of strange goings-on within Michinoku Pro Wrestling, which appears to be falling apart at the seams, with Great Sasuke possibly leaving for WWF. Sasuke's WWF deal isn't finalized, or at least wasn't as of the weekend, as to anything other than doing the dates this past week. Michinoku Pro is now advertising Sasuke's match on July 19th as his final match in Japan before going full-time with WWF. Shiryu has left MPW and is now in Mexico. Jinsei Shinzaki has left and is working for FMW. The situation with Super Delphin isn't clear either, although he is booked on the July 19th show, but at a press conference this past week Sasuke said that Delphin had also quit the promotion. Vampiro Canadiense from Mexico was fired since he missed a recent tour claiming an injury, but the office found out he was working regularly in Mexico. FMW announced a big show on August 2nd outdoors at the Shiodome, a makeshift arena in a field in Tokyo, with a no-rope barbed wire explosive electrified death match with Masato Tanaka vs. Wing Kanemura on top, with the winner getting a match later this year against Atsushi Onita. The semifinal has Hayabusa and Jinsei Shinzaki vs. Hisakatsu Oya and Mr. Ganasuke. AJW announced its main event for August 20th at Budokan Hall as being Kyoko Inoue defending the WWA title against Yumiko Hata. AJW just doesn't have the drawing power nowadays to book a building the size of Budokan Hall, and that main event isn't going to cut it. The Fuji Network this past weekend broadcasted the June 30th Pancrase card from Hakata, which would be the first Pancrase show on network television. Their shows have been on cable, which doesn't have anywhere close to the penetration that cable in the US has. Black Hayabusa in FMW is definitely Jose Estrada Jr. USWA. The angle last week involving Billy Travis being arrested on live television was only partly an angle. Apparently Travis' daughter was flipping the dial on June 21st and saw her father on the wrestling show. Apparently the ex-wife and daughter had no idea he was back working in wrestling, which is really scary, since he's been pushed there for months. They called the police since he allegedly owes child support and alimony, and the police showed up at the studio on June 28. Jerry Lawler, who apparently knew the officers, asked them to wait until the show was over to take him, but they said they had a job to do. Lawler then talked it over with them to try and make it an angle, apparently saying they could take him while he was on TV and he'd fight them off as a work in exchange for them agreeing not to try and add resisting arrest charges, which all agreed to, and that was what happened. On television to explain the situation, they had Brian Christopher claim he pressed charges against Travis for vandalizing his truck to make it part of their feud. Apparently, to make matters worse, Travis' daughter was watching TV on June 28 and seeing the police fighting with her father and arresting him, and she went hysterical to the point she had to be taken to the hospital. PG-13 returned as heels, saying that they were representing ECW and also started up an affiliation with them and PJ Walker. They showed the Lawler/Cornette angle from ECW on television this week, along with several taped ECW interviews building up July 13. They did an angle during the week where Travis attacked Christopher at one of the casino shows where they claimed Travis had just gotten sprung from jail. They've announced that Mabel has injured Razor Ramon. There are lots of rumors about Vince McMahon having financial involvement in this company. For whatever this is worth, the name signing the checks is that of Lawler. While it is not definite, it is a strong probability that Tom Pritchard will be moving here and the WWF will be conducting its training base here, with the wrestlers under contract with WWF working this territory to gain experience. There is supposed to be a major announcement this week, which likely has to do with this group attempting to expand into new markets. Here and there. The WWO has a show scheduled for San Jose, California on July 26 with La Parka and Silver King and Dandy vs. Yokozuna and Samu and Fatu, Los Villanos vs. Doink the Clown, Matt Osborne, and Psicosis and Misterioso, Damien and Halloween and Phobia vs. Super Parka and Super Colo and Rey Mysterio Sr., Natasha, Barbara Blaze, vs. Lady Victoria, and the match that'll steal the show with Mini Rey Mysterio Jr., formerly Mascarada Sagrada Jr. in AAA and WWF, and Ultimo Dragon Cheeto vs. Damien Cito and Espectrito, formerly Mini Vader. NWA on August 24 in Yardville, New Jersey as Devon Storm vs. Reckless Youth in a match where the only way to win is by doing a leap from the top of the cage. Doug Gilbert vs. Buddy Landell in a cage plus Goldust appearing. There was a ton of media pub over the past week about the Disney record label dropping a band called Insane Clown Posse because of the lyrics of a song called The Great Malenko, which also talks about Cactus Jack. A second label has already picked them up. Their gimmick is that they play using payasos costumes, so there's a lot of wrestling-related gimmickry in their look and music. In the obits on legendary newscaster Charles Kuralt, there were talks with two of his longtime friends, Charlotte-based personalities C.J. Underwood and Ty Boyd, who were both ring announcers at the Charlotte Coliseum for pro wrestling during the 70s and 80s. Both owned in Blockhead Productions in Montreal are planning on producing wrestling documentaries. Otto won CWA Euro Catch Festival on July 5 in Graz, Austria drew 1,500 fans. The newly created Senior Heavyweight title was won by Michael Kovac, Battlerts, beating Christian Eckstein. Ulf Herman and Tony St. Clair won the vacant CWA tag titles, beating Robbie Brookside and Mark the Hunter. Mark Mercedes from Australia, a former Malenko student, and David Finlay, WCW Belfast Bruiser, retained the CWA Intercontinental title, beating Kevin Logan. EMLL Kevin Quinn, while Franz Schumann retained the CWA Middleweight title, beating Jose Estrada Jr. of the current WWF Los Boricuas and formerly Crypt Keeper and Black Hayabusa in FMW. They had a sumo challenge with Emmanuel Yarborough, the 6'8", 640-pounder of UFC 3 fame, who won 4 sumo matches in a row before losing to Rasta the Voodoo Man. There was a lot of heat for the sumo matches but told it was negative star material. The main event saw Rambo, Luke Poirier, retain the CWA heavyweight title pinning Duke Dries in 21:55. After the match, Rambo made his farewell speech, vacating the title because he signed with the WWF. There were a lot of tears from his speech both among fans and wrestlers. Schumann was the champion of the Graz tournament with Rasta, Finlay and Tony St. Clair tied for second. There is a new TV station in Germany and Austria called DSF Action, which is a full-time pro wrestling station airing all the current WWF and WCW programming along with 1995 to 1996 ECW tapes, AAA, ICW, lots of old women's tapes from US and even Japan, and all the pay-per-view shows on a 2-week tape delay. Larry Sharp has a show on July 29th in Wildwood, New Jersey with Mankind vs. Balls Mahoney, Jimmy Snuka vs. King Kong Bundy and Headbangers on the show. A correction from the results section in The Observer regarding an ICW show in Cloverdale, BC and a wrestler listed as Matt Bourne. Actually, the name used was Matt Byrne. Bourne works the same territory for rival promotions. There was an article in the Daily Oklahoman on July 1st regarding a hearing on pro wrestling regulation that even the author recognized as a role reversal. The state director of boxing argued on June 27 that pro wrestling is dangerous. The wrestlers argued that it's harmless entertainment. The Boxing Commission shut down a Power Zone wrestling show because the promoters didn't get licensed. Administrative Hearing Officer Jeff Lee will issue a ruling in about a week. Roger Coyle, the attorney representing Power Zone, asked why the state doesn't regulate Hamlet, female mud wrestling or midget wrestling. Jim Gasso, head of the commission, responded that they should regulate mud wrestling and midget wrestling. Coyle tried to point out that his wrestlers all had gelatinous beer bullies trying to get over that they aren't athletes. Gasso then argued that just because a guy has a big belly doesn't mean he's not an athlete. Tom Jones, who teaches pro wrestling at the local school and was something of a name wrestler in the area a generation ago, said that pro wrestling punches couldn't break an egg. Charlie Polk, a promoter for the group, claimed pro wrestling has no more body contact than dancing. NHB. The problems financially stemming from the bans from various cable companies continues to threaten the future of UFC. As mentioned last week, Semaphore Entertainment Group has pulled Carlos Barreto and Murillo Bustamante off the July 27th pay-per-view show because of the costs of flying them and their entourages in from Brazil, and replacing them with fighters with lesser name value. Apparently Semaphore Entertainment Group has done the budget and figures that this upcoming show is going to lose money no matter what, and they are trying to keep the losses as low as possible. The current plan is that the heavyweight tournament will have Mark Kerr vs. Daniel Bobish and Brian Johnston vs. Modi Horenstein, and the light heavyweight tournament will have Kevin Jackson vs. Yuri Valens and Joe Moreira vs. Todd Butler. Semaphore Entertainment Group will no longer use the term no holds barred in advertising its events, and the term has been banned for usage on its television shows. Instead, the events are to be called either reality fighting or mixed martial arts. In addition, the scheduled September 26th pay-per-view show from Russia is being moved to October 17th, and the change in date means the show won't be in Russia. They are moving it back 3 weeks because they are crossing their fingers and hoping that with the new rules that some cable systems will agree to carry the follow-up show, and 3 weeks give them more time to attempt to get systems to reverse their position, something at this point there is no groundswell to do. There was a Vale Tudo show on July 6th in Sao Paulo, Brazil before 800 fans with an 8-man tournament won by Gary Goodridge beating the Pedro Otavio in about 18 minutes with the old iron claw to the groin finish that Fritz von Erich popularized in 1972 Texas death matches against Stan Stasiak. That's right, Goodridge first tried the claw on the balls but couldn't make Otavio tap, so he put his hand inside Otavio's trunks and squeezed and made him tap. The fans went nuts seeing an American do that to a Brazilian and nearly rioted, chanting fag and a lot worse at Goodridge. In the superfight, Dan Severn increased his record to 13-3-1, beat Ebenezer Fontes in 20 minutes when the ref stopped the match. Fontes didn't go down early and dominated the standing game, and Severn was bloodied up before he managed to take down and pounded Fontes on the ground till it was stopped. Speaking of Severn, reports on his match on June 26th in Council Bluffs, Iowa against Jeremy Horn that went to a 20-minute draw were that if there were judges, that Horn, who dominated the fight, would have won, which isn't a good sign considering Severn is now 39 years old. ECW no shows over the weekend. The Cornette Angle aired on television this week and it was quite good. Paul Heyman said that Cornette was not given the right to script the angle and that he had Chris Condito present the angle to Cornette beforehand and Cornette accepted it. He said that he agreed that Dennis Corraluzzo could use ECW talent on his shows provided Corraluzzo go through ECW to get the talent and that the talent was willing to work the shows. He said that none of his wrestlers want to work for Corraluzzo with the exception of PG-13. He said he'd welcome Cornette's input into any angle he's involved in but that he would always have to have the final say-so. He said that he never promised to apologize to Corraluzzo in front of the boys but was asked to bring Corraluzzo into the dressing room and tell the boys it was okay to work for him, but that he didn't do that because of heat some of the wrestlers had with Corraluzzo and that Todd Gordon still has with him. WCW. Nitro on July 7th in Memphis drew 7,799 fans, 7,230 paying $114,705. It was just shy of a sellout in the configuration they were set up for and a few hundred less than they drew for the previous Nitro in the city, but with the higher ticket prices it was the largest gate ever for pro wrestling in Memphis. It was a great television show mainly for the booking. Show opened with a Curt Hennig interview. Hennig got a weak pop coming out, but did a heel interview and fans were booing him. Ric Flair and a woman came out and Flair talked like Hennig would be a horseman but Hennig said he was a free agent going to the highest bidder. He said he'd be wrestling on Sunday but didn't say he'd be Page's partner. They never mentioned who Page's partner would be but the TV hints were either Hennig or Larry Zbyszko. Public Enemy beat Harlem Heat in 4:55 when Sherry shoved Rocco off the top rope but he crashed into Stevie Ray and Grunge pinned Ray while Booker T was chasing Vincent away. After the match the Heat fired Sherry and she said at the same time that she quit. Bad match. Conan beat Joe Gomez via submission with the Tequila Sunrise in 3:11. Bad. Juventud Guerrera and Hector Garza beat Villanos 4-5 in 6:16 when Guerrera used the 450 splash on B. Not a lot of heat but a great TV match with tons of high flying, and Juventud nailed every spot right on the money. It was one of those matches where the heels looked unspectacular, but it was their steadiness that made the faces shine. Crowd gave both teams a standing O after the match. Scott Hall, Randy Savage and Elizabeth came out and they teased a lot of tension with Hall and Zbyszko, who wouldn't leave the broadcast position. Scott Norton and Marcus Bagwell beat Eddie Guerrero and Chavo Jr. in 8:01. Eddie walked out on Chavo leaving him to get destroyed. At one point when Chavo was hanging tough, Eddie came back out, but watched from the ramp and walked off again. Finally Bagwell got the pin with the buff blockbuster. Later in the show they showed Eddie and Chavo fighting backstage. It was real good for what it was. Diamond Dallas Page, wearing a la parka costume, pinned Randy Savage with the diamond cutter in 3:10. An excellent angle. Usually in angles like this it's easy to tell it's a ruse, but Page's work and timing was incredible, right down to doing the parka strut early. Psychosis and Silver King no contest Glacier and Ernest Miller in 2:17 when Wrath and Mortis interfered. Even this was great television, particularly the three-way post-match brawl. Lots of people are down on the arcade game wrestler's gimmick, but Mortis has potential to be a great worker and Psychosis did a corkscrew moonsault block off the top which was incredible. Ric Flair did an interview with a mannequin that didn't break. It was vintage Flair bragging that Piper was just another stiff he's carried and made like 200 other guys. Flair said that during his career he's carried more stiffs than there are apples in Washington. Piper came out and the two began brawling with the classic 1979, and every bit as good when it was repeated nationally in 1989. Flair Steamboat angle with Flair ending up with his suit ripped up and brawling, chopping and bumping in his underwear and a tie. Finally Benoit and McMichael came in and they got Piper down and Benoit did a great headbutt off the top on him before Jeff Jarrett made the save. Stevie Richards debuted doing his ECW flunky to Raven gimmick on an interview with Mike Tenay. Raven punched Richards at the end. Richards was good on the mic but for anyone who has seen ECW in the last 6 months, the thing with Richards going in the time machine back 18 months would have been really lame. Steiners beat Benoit and McMichael in 9:16 of a good bout. Well, very good with Benoit in, not nearly so good with Mongo in, ending when Kevin Sullivan cracked a chair on Benoit's head and Rick pinned him. Jacqueline returned and she and Sullivan argued big time after. Show ended with a Hogan interview and fans pelting him with garbage. Luger and the Giant came out. Luger racked Eric Bischoff while Giant choke slammed Vincent and Bagwell while Hogan ran off rather than help his fellow NWOites. There was a loud Lawler chant during the Savage match. The two had a major feud in the early and mid-80s which did record business at the time. Arnold Anderson was backstage for the first time since his operation, helping Terry Taylor with the booking. Also backstage were Dave Brown and Corey Macklin. Bischoff was in Mexico this past week negotiating with Paco Alonso. Not sure of what came out of it, but they met on July 2nd. Alonso, who had also been negotiating with WWF, told WWF that Bischoff offered him $750,000 in exchange for 15 wrestlers under contract. Others are denying that story is correct, although when Vince McMahon was given the story, his recommendation was for Alonso to sign with Bischoff because he wasn't about to match that deal. He also met with Promo Azteca and gave his ideas for doing the promotion versus promotion feud and taping big shows in Mexico for US pay-per-view. In the original booking plan for the Mysterio Jr. vs. Nash match in Las Vegas on June 30th, Mysterio Jr. was supposed to pin Nash after hitting him with a roll of coins, but then get destroyed after the match. The plan was changed sometime between Saturday night and Monday night. It's just as well that it was, because nobody would have bought that finish. A correction on the deal about Ric Flair and a Dr. Pepper commercial. Dr. Pepper had a deal where they tested out Flair, Randy Savage and the Giant on June 27th and were going to pick one of them for a commercial which wouldn't necessarily end up being Flair. Nitro is on in a 1-hour syndication version in Canada, apparently edited by monkeys. For example, on June 30th, after spending the whole show building up the surprise, the show ends just as Hogan is coming out in the run-in, so you don't see Curt Hennig's debut. A few weeks earlier, when they had the Ric Flair vs. Scott Hall main event, they aired the first hour of the show with the angle leading to the match, and then the show went off the air in the middle of a Wall Street match. Nancy Sullivan is definitely history. She and Kevin have also really split up. Kevin will be back in the office, but most seem to believe Taylor is going to wind up with more power because everything has been so much better organized since he took control. Add to the list of dearly departed from WCW when their 90-day windows are up to their contracts as Renegade, Lanny Poffo, Colonel Rob Parker, Jerry Lynn, David Taylor, Pat Tanaka and the French Canadians. Some of the guys being dumped may get a restructured deal or be taken off guarantee but still used. For example, there is talk that Duggan will be taken off his $250,000 per year deal and work on a per night deal and mainly be used in a PR capacity, and not so much if any in the ring. Wall Street has told friends he's been offered a new deal. Ice Train may be kept around provided he moves to Atlanta, etc. Jim Powers may also be on that list. Radio ads in Philadelphia for the July 26th Spectrum show list Hogan and Hall and Nash vs. Flair and Giant and Luger as the main event, but they were cut before Hogan vetoed doing the show. Card is Hall and Nash defending against Luger and Giant, Page vs. Savage death match, Flair vs. Six, Jarrett defending against McMichael, Steiners vs. Bagwell and Norton, Malenko vs. Eddie Guerrero, Benoit vs. Steven Regal, Chris Jericho defending the Cruiserweight belt against Alex Wright and Public Enemy vs. French Canadians. It is believed Richards signed a deal for $85,000 per. Due to it being a holiday weekend, no ratings are available at press time. Luger was on Regis and Kathy Lee on July 7th talking about how to train abs. Hey, I've got the one-word answer. Liposuction. Kevin Green's first child, a boy named Gavin, was born in an induced labor on June 16th right after the pay-per-view show. Another source of TV viewership figures from England claims that on May 30th, most recent date available, that Raw had 240,000 viewers while Nitro had 190,000. Raw is consistently the highest-rated show on Sky Sports 2. Sky Sports 2 is a subscription station a la Showtime, while TNT Europe is a basic cable station, and thus it's easier to draw more viewers. WWF. Complete SummerSlam lineup for August 3rd at the Continental Airlines Arena in East Rutherford, New Jersey is Undertaker defending the WWF title against Bret Hart, with Hart vowing to never wrestle in the US again if he doesn't win, which should guarantee that result. Owen Hart defending the IC title against Steve Austin, with Austin vowing to kiss Owen's ass in the ring if he doesn't win, which should guarantee a second title change. Davey Boy Smith vs. Ken Shamrock for the European title, Mankind vs. Hunter Hearst Helmsley in a cage match, Legion of Doom vs. Godwins, Sid vs. Vader provided Sid is ready by then, an 8-man tag with Los Boricuas vs. DOA, and the free-for-all match is Goldust vs. Brian Pillman, with Pillman having to wear one of Marlena's dresses if he loses. Given that the two other stip matches are going to result in title changes rather than stips, I'd bet Pillman has to lose the stip to set up people believing the others may happen later in the show. Icon magazine, which hit the newsstands this past week, has an 8-page profile on Vince McMahon written by Philip Zabriskie. It's a very sympathetic portrayal of McMahon, with a lot talking about his bitterness from his childhood upbringing and how he got into wrestling. According to McMahon, my life as a kid could not have been any more screwed up than it was, and I'll let your imagination make up the rest. Since this is McMahon we're talking about, You never know exactly where truth and storytelling differentiate. It brings up the war with WCW but no more than several other subjects. There are quotes from numerous people in wrestling, from Eric Bischoff, the only one Zabriskie quoted as really saying anything all that negative about him but guaranteed not the only to say anything negative about him, Kevin Nash, Jim Ross, Jerry Lawler, Gorilla Monsoon, Randy Savage, Linda McMahon and myself. There's a lot about the childhood of McMahon that really hasn't been covered in the past. The story is well written, although there is no added insight to the wrestling industry. Some of the portrayal's history is kind of hilarious to those who lived through it. One thing hilarious is that McMahon apparently tried to take credit for the idea of doing localized market-specific interviews and got wrestlers to record the different interviews for the different markets. I can't tell you how long market-specific interviews have been around wrestling, but they've been around far longer than McMahon has been around. The same magazine had a story on the late Andy Kaufman written by his former manager, which has a few paragraphs about his forays into wrestling. It's mind-blowing that Icon magazine has two different stories in the same issues with Lawler in both of them. It treats the Lawler/Kaufman angle as if it were a shoot. It was a 100% work. Raw on July 7th in Edmonton drew 9,500, 7,108 paying $135,270. The gate in a sense would be the largest ever for a live Raw taping, but that should have an asterisk next to it because in US dollars that's $99,000, or lower than the previous record of $115,271 set on March 10th in Worcester, Massachusetts. Crowd wasn't quite as hot at Calgary the night before, but it was still a hot crowd and a very good show. Bret Hart opened doing a long babyface interview that was his best performance in many weeks. He was wearing an Edmonton Oilers jersey to guarantee the right response, as if there was going to be a problem. He brought out Owen and Bulldog, both wearing Oilers jerseys, and they played the Canadian national anthem. Austin came out from behind and hit all of them with chairs. It was unintentionally funny because Bret took his bump before he was hit with the chair since he saw the others go down. Then Austin went back and hit him when he wasn't ready and nailed his elbow, which is exactly how you don't want to take that spot. McMahon apologized big over that spot. Love those sincere apologies. Bret did another interview during the commercial break saying that this is what he has to put up with every week in America. McMahon portrayed the Hart Foundation as total babyfaces and Austin as the heel during most of the show, and particularly in regard to that spot. Great Sasuke pinned Taka Michinoku, or as Doak Hendricks would say, Tako Michinoku, in 5:46 with a Thunder Fire power bomb. Not as good as the previous night, but Taka was still the best wrestler on the card by a mile, and this was probably the best match of the night on either show, although the Villanos on WCW were close. He slipped doing a moonsault to the floor, so came back with an Osai moonsault. Sasuke did both a majestic flip dive in the open and a space-flying tiger drop near the finish. Brian Christopher was at ringside, and it seemed like they were building to Christopher versus Sasuke down the line. During the commercial break, Savio Vega did a big heel interview to try and make sure DOA would get the face reaction. Given the bikes, that shouldn't have been a problem. Vega versus Crush was a double countout in 2:24 when all the rest of the guys ran in. Better than you'd think. During the post-match, one of the Harris brothers dropped Jesus, who is formerly Huracan Castillo, on a bike and may have injured him. Paul Bearer did another interview talking about Kane, saying he's badly disfigured. When they went back to the crowd after the interview, you could see the disbelief in their faces. This was a real lemon of an interview continuing a lemon of an angle. Owen and Bulldog beat Farouk and D'Lo Brown in 6:50 via countout when Pillman and Kama were both involved outside the ring. Bout was much better than expected due to Owen's work. Because of the win, Owen and Bulldog meet Austin and mystery partner on July 14th in San Antonio for the tag team titles. Austin beat Helmsley in 9:26 with a stunner in a good match with the fans split in reactions. I think the fans really wanted to cheer Austin, but the anthem deal made a lot of them cheer Helmsley. Chyna interfered, but Mankind hit Helmsley with a chair to set up the win. Austin did a post-match interview and called Mankind in the ring. They ended up hugging, but he turned on Mankind and hit him with a stunner, which got a huge face pop. Most fans cheered Austin at this point as he was leaving. Mankind vowed revenge next week. Christopher beat Eric Shelley in 3:52 with a leg drop off the top. Shelley, son of Len Kojic Shelley, who wrestled in the very first match I ever saw live, tried really hard but was really green in trying to do space age moves. Lawler and Christopher beat up Shelley after the match. Off TV, Christopher and Sonny left arm in arm. Austin did yet another interview, some cheers but mainly boos at this point, regarding his match with Owen. Finale saw Bret pin Goldust with a cradle in 10:21. Below average match. Brett's knee was clearly not close to ready and he worked a heel style. DOA, Hart Foundation, LOD and Shamrock were all at ringside by the finish. Not much on the Shotgun show. Owen beat Flash Funk in a match where the last few minutes were said to be very good. Pillman did an interview regarding Summer Slam. Dark match main saw Brett and Owen and Bulldog over LOD and Austin when Brett pinned Austin in just 4:30 and they brought Stu Hart out to a big pop, as Stu grew up in Edmonton and started promoting wrestling there in 1948. Shawn Michaels had his meeting with the WWF in Stamford, Connecticut on July 3rd and will be on Raw on July 14th, although probably not wrestling. Besides the tag title match in the Lawlers vs. Putskis, there will be a third hour of wrestling that night at 10 p.m. which will be tapes of old matches called the Night of 100 Stars with them advertising Hogan, Flair, Warrior, Savage, Diesel, Razor, Brett, Undertaker, Austin, Michaels, Piper, Perfect and Rude is appearing. I'd suspect it'll do a good number. Whether it emphasizes that most of the big stars are now in WCW so it's Pennywise, dollar foolish so to speak, or whether people take it as if the guys in WCW all look older now and are washed up is speculative. WCW is going to attempt to use it saying that the WWF lawsuit over confusion in the marketplace holds no water since advertising this show to draw a rating is attempting to do something similar. The feeling from their tryouts on June 30th is that Sean Morley, Steele and CMLL showed potential but wasn't ready yet, which I'd concur with having seen him regularly of late, and that Del Wilkes did well. After they finish in the Maritimes, WWF is going to send Randy Blackbeard and Glenn Kulka to Memphis to work as a tag team. Cornette and Ross announced Shotgun for this coming week as well. TSN aired Raw live on June 30th, which normally isn't the case. The show usually airs on about a 4-hour tape delay on Monday nights after the conclusion of major sports programming in Canada and is repeated on Tuesday afternoons. Ahmed Johnson may also make an appearance on Raw on July 14th, although he won't be back in the ring until August. Sid now has a sciatic nerve problem and his left leg has been going numb, likely stemming from the auto accident. They are hopeful he'll be at SummerSlam, but that match wasn't announced publicly because there's no definite word. The only weekend regular house show was July 4th in Vancouver, BC, drawing $10,462 and $200,064. Vancouver was the same basic show as they did in Los Angeles last week with the Triangle match. It appears they are going to have Undertaker pin Brett in all the Triangle bouts since Brett is getting the strap. Crowd in Vancouver reacted similar to Calgary. Crowd really hated Shamrock against Neidhart. Not as in hated the match, hated Shamrock. Triangle match was said to have been bad, going 8 minutes. They did $209,000 Canadian in merchandise over the 3-city tour. The feeling is that due to the Donovan Bailey-Michael Johnson race and the fact Canada hasn't done well as a national team in hockey nor has a Canadian team won the Stanley Cup as to why the US versus Canada feud is playing so much better in Canada. Obviously Canadians have more of a resentment of Americans than vice versa. The readers' pages. Choshu. I'm very happy reading your Riki Choshu article. You may ask another Japanese friend to translate my 1995 book story on Choshu. Not surprisingly, both were almost the same. But if that was a complete history of Choshu, I think the following points were missing. His peculiar views toward the wrestling media should be mentioned. Choshu is the one who forced Tarzan Yamamoto out from Weekly Pro Wrestling, the highest class wrestling magazine. He is also well known for openly saying that the only media he cares about is Tokyo Sports. The very first interpromotional angle was created and developed in the editing room of Tokyo Sports before Choshu himself became a pencil. Choshu may feel that because of that he owes his career to Tokyo Sports. Once again in 1995, the UWFI vs. New Japan angle was carefully planned by Soichi Shibata of Tokyo Sports, who was my personal pick for the MVP of Pro Wrestling Journalists in 1995. Choshu has never been a good worker in my opinion or the opinion of many of the older New Japan fans. No matter what you or other American specialists on Japan say, I strongly believe that fans my age and the older Japanese reporters, most of whom don't speak English, have never thought of him as a solid worker. The younger Japanese press with their connections to American newsletters that grew up during the Choshu vs. Tatsumi Fujinami feud will speak differently, but the older reporters have a very different view. He never had any memorable great matches against foreigners. Because of that, New Japan shifted to a Japanese versus Japanese promotion which made older fans terribly disappointed. Many were attracted to pro wrestling because it was an international sport, so for fans like that, Choshu isn't acceptable as a top star because he couldn't work well with foreigners. When he first started in the business, all of the press hated Choshu and he hates the press except Tokyo Sports. From his numerous interviews, I believe Choshu never really was a pro wrestling fan. I've written the same way you have about praising him for not having a selfish ego, but the reality may be slightly different. Kensuke Sasaki has always been pushed despite being a poor talent. Keiji Muto was never pushed correctly because Choshu doesn't like his style of a worker. Despite its huge business success, New Japan has lost a lot during the Choshu booking era, including the long quest for finding a cross line between shooting and working that is no longer there. The first Tokyo Dome show in 1989 was the beginning of shoot-style pro wrestling, but he gave up using slow-learning Russians rather quickly and let the UWF movement grow. For older New Japan fans, many felt that the Yuko Miyato booked UWFI was the modern-day version of New Japan. Yuji Nagata and Shinjiro Otani may have proven that a New Japan-style worker can be great at any style, but those two aren't enough. For those who remember when Kotetsu Yamamoto booked New Japan, they like watching JWP nowadays more than World Pro Wrestling since JWP uses many old New Japan storylines. In the past, New Japan was always able to find and get over fresh and very capable foreigners despite having a weak connection with the NWO due to All Japan. However, Choshu focuses on Japanese versus Japanese. Then FMW began to revive the Texas Deathmatch, a New Japan staple, while Michinoku Pro began doing sophisticated lucha libre and they discovered and brought in many good foreign talents. In the same fashion, Rings brought in many Olympic-caliber fighters. Choshu's booking has forced young kids and older fans out of the arenas and I very much worry about it. As I watch the Canadian Stampede Ppv, signs of this is work rate and what's kayfabe were in the background. I loved it. We are in the new era of pro wrestling as a pure entertainment business. The performance of Taka Michinoku, the king of selling, was just what I had hoped for. I'm not exactly happy with your writing on the June 21st Rings show. First, I strongly believe that Masayuki Naruse and Mitsuya Nagai's matches were both shoots. You can tell by the post-match interview context. The WOW production team is unique in pro wrestling since they handle other sports as well, such as Mike Tyson fights. Since they aren't on the Rings payroll, they somewhat hint in commentary for the 1 or 2% of fans who can read between the lines what is shooting and what isn't. Post-match interview reactions aren't something fighters can pretend like actors after a shoot match. We all know short matches are hard to tell whether they are shoots, however Nagai has to prove himself to the kickboxing world that he's capable in a shoot situation against Andre Manart, a well-known kickboxer. Nagai's next fight will probably be a work, but that's understandable since you can't do a shoot every month. Rings Japanese members with the exception of Akira Maeda seem to be rotating who participates in the shoot matches and all the young wrestlers have proven that they are real. Naruse even challenged Gracie fighters in his post-match interview. You can't fake those comments unless you've just won a real fight. Naruse is too small to be considered a world-ranked shooter but he is real and I like his guts. Out of 7 matches that day, 4 were shoots, which is more than 50%. You should focus more on praising Rings as their recent efforts appear to be more shoot-oriented. Probably 95% of your readers don't know much about Rings, so you should educate your readers to new styles. I think you have a bad habit of describing NHB as something better than Pancrase style. Most professional fights usually have some kind of pre-match agreements beforehand. The Oleg Toktarov versus Marco Ruiz match in Brazil was like a Pancrase theme match where they were standing only. But what was the advertised rules? The agreements would violate Vale Tudo rules. Yes, the match was a shoot, just as Pancrase and K1 can claim within their rules and pre-match agreements. They are all walking on thin ice. The true Vale Tudo anything goes rules days are over. In fact, the June 21st Vale Tudo rules matches on the Rings show were shoot matches but they banned headbutts and elbows. We should accept Pancrase-style shoot matches instead of splitting hairs on some questionable showboating involved. Fans pay to see the skills, not exactly who is the stronger fighter, since we know results can change quickly and top stars would be ranked differently due to even slight rule changes. Many top fighters just can't participate in UFC due to its poor financial guarantees as compared to the fighters under contract to Rings. For example, how would you rate Volkan as a shooter? Although he's not truly tested, he is real and many insiders and fighters themselves compare him favorably to Oleg Toktarov and other top NHB fighters. Those observations are not fantasy but come from dojo rankings. Ricardo Moraes is a jiu-jitsu fighter who hasn't mastered jiu-jitsu yet. It was funny to watch him wondering what to do next. But his monster looks are extremely marketable within the fighting business. Last year, Lukain Mikhail faced the stronger black belt Agilson Lima while Yoshihisa Yamamoto faced purple belt Moraes in the main event. Insiders knew Moraes had no ranking in Brazilian jiu-jitsu, It meant nothing from a business standpoint because Lima-type fighters are all the same and boring to watch to the general public. The question will be if Morris is interested in doing worked matches or not. If he isn't, rings should forget what happened in shoot matches the last 2 years. Even though unskilled in the ground game, Morris' size advantage was too much for medium-sized Yamamoto. The reason I believe Maurice Smith has no chance to win against Yamamoto under either Pancrase or EFC rules is that hybrid fighters know too many of Smith's weaknesses since he's fought in Japan about 20 times over the past 10 years. I was very happy to see Smith beating Conan Silveira, but it was because the Carlson Gracie camp and Kazunari Murakami types don't know the standing game or enough about Smith. For UWF-style wrestlers, not only Yamamoto but many other could easily beat Smith clean, I think. But that doesn't mean Yamamoto could beat Silveira in an EFC rules match. Kiyoshi Tamura's job for Nikolai Zuev was expected since the rumor is he got his salary doubled in June. In Japan, the industry rule is that the first match of any new big contract should be a job. Besides, Zuev is not just a fighter but also the promoter in Russia for rings, so the company always keeps him with a high ranking. The most important thing in reviewing the June 21st show is not which matches were shoot matches, but what was the best match on the show. You should have emphasized that once again it was Tamura's match. Considering the pressure he was under following all those matches that were shoots, he did very, very well. Tadashi Tanaka. New York, New York. Raw vs. Nitro. The Undertaker interview on the June 30th Raw from Des Moines really sucked live. The crowd thought it was really lame. Steve Austin was over huge and Legion of Doom and Undertaker were over as faces. DOA got a big pop. Only Brian Pillman and Brian Christopher got any real heel heat all night. Brett, Pillman and Austin were all limping noticeably. Undertaker beat Vader in 5 minutes and Vader got zero offense. The arena was less than half full and for the most part the fans sat on their hands. It was the worst crowd I've ever seen. Very little noise. In most matches you could hear a pin drop. As a longtime WWF supporter, I've always believed that Vince McMahon and his crew had better characters and better angles. However, if this is an indication of what is going on in the WWF today, Vince is in need of some new blood to jumpstart the promotion. I've always regularly attended WWF shows since they started coming to Iowa. With the exception of C-Team tour shows when the cards consisted of nothing but preliminary matches, the crowd reacted as little as ever with little interest in either the matches or the wrestlers. I hope this isn't a trend. Mike Payne. Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Thanks for pointing out how Raw has copied Nitro's intros, graphics and format. Even the theme music is similar. The people who say they're the innovators are the imitators, being beaten at their own game. Are we really supposed to rate those entertainment matches on technical merit? It's true, the main event at Slamboree couldn't hold a candle to the Ric Flair-Ricky Steamboat matches. But as you said, from an entertainment perspective it was great. The promoters and mainstream fans don't give a rip about work rate. It's the matchups themselves that create the excitement, dollars and ratings that are remembered and valued. I just finished watching the golden age of wrestling on Classic Sports featuring the Sheik's old promotion. It was just as I remember, not good. Bob Geigel's NWA office ran a very similar looking TV show. Looking back, the fascinating thing is the rabid crowd heat, despite the slow pace and total lack of stiffness in these bouts. Judging by the expression on the audience members' faces, most seemed to buy into every minute of it. Guys today putting on matches of this low caliber would be quickly booed out of the building. Nobody wants to admit it, but even Jim Duggan is a better worker. As much as people harp on the glory days of the 70s and 80s Georgia and Mid-Atlantic wrestling, much of which does hold up fairly well, the workers of today are by and large far more talented and without a doubt held to a much higher standard. You only need to compare the Sheik with Sabu to see clear evidence of it. John Drake. Athens, Georgia. Wrestling Observer Newsletter. P.O. Box 1228, Campbell, California 95009-1228. July 14, 1997.